But this raises actually an interesting question and leads quite naturally to the next question I'd want to raise. So I would accept certainly your wise judgment about the importance of criteria, and being honest about what those are. But one of the criteria, interestingly enough, that you mentioned, the criteria of embarrassment, though it could be quite effective, for example, in isolating details that we could, as a result of embarrassment or non-continuity, be pretty sure they would go back to the historical Jesus. The problem, it seems to me, would be, well, then, what do we do? How do we go from detail to gestalt, to overall form? In other words, the problem with that criterion, I would say, is that from the very beginning, it would presume we're going to get a kind of California or guru Jesus, you know, the Jesus who doesn't match up with the quote-unquote power structures of the day, which, in the end, I'm sure you would agree, would not be a good use of these criteria, yet at one level would seem to set up for the historian of the historical Jesus exactly that end product. So maybe if you could reflect just briefly on that problem, and then more generally on how do we relate then the historical details and the historical figure that emerges from the research like you do to the Jesus that the church proclaims in the creeds.
Yeah, first of all, I think one reason that there are a number of criteria, and indeed I purposely omitted one which I think addresses your concern in particular, but first of all, the very fact that there are a number of criteria is that no single criterion will give us anything close to a reliable historical Jesus, because indeed, you know, as they always say, to the man with one hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if your only criterion is embarrassment or discontinuity, then indeed you're going to wind up with this figure that is totally disconnected from the whole context which supposedly produced him and which he's addressing. So, I often say to people, it would be like saying to get to, imagine for a moment that Martin Luther never wrote anything down, which is leap of imagination, but namely that everything was his Tishreden, everything was his table talks, that his sermons, everything he delivered to his followers and disciples, and only they wrote it down, that he never did. And so we have to reconstruct Martin Luther from voluminous, absolutely voluminous material that all his disciples wrote about everything he said and did. But then we decide, well, of course, how do we separate that from early scholastic Lutheranism that arises fairly quickly? Well, we'll decide only what in this whole deposit of material, only that which has absolutely no connection with late medieval Augustinianism on the one hand, and no connection with early scholastic Lutheranism on the other, only that comes from Martin Luther. Well, you get a terribly distorted picture of Martin Luther. That he was, to the end of his life, in many ways, a late Augustinian monk. He still heard confessions. He still practiced a number of Catholic pieties to the end. He wasn't entirely happy with a totally vernacular liturgy. And on the other hand, of course, early scholastic Lutheranism, of course, did take a great deal from Martin Luther, although they perhaps systematized in a way he would not have been too happy with. So too, therefore, with the historical Jesus, you're quite correct. If we simply go hog wild with embarrassment and discontinuity, we get this totally, you might say, rather than historical Jesus, totally an ahistorical Jesus, totally detached from his time. So that is why I would stress, among other things, another criterion, which sort of, and all the criteria hopefully are meant to work together. Like the various keyboards on the organ plus the pedal, that they need to be all playing together. And certainly one criterion that balances very much, I think, the criterion, say, of discontinuity, embarrassment, is what is called different things, but say the criterion of coherence. Namely, once from the first criteria I mentioned, we can build up what we might call a fairly solid, reliable database. Well, therefore, other sayings and deeds of Jesus that fit in with this and make sense in his own time, in his own place, in Jewish Palestine, they have a fair chance as well. And so coherence is used to sort of broaden out the picture. And discontinuity does work in another way, which I think helps prevent this totally ahistorical picture as well. Namely, a picture of Jesus who is discontinuous entirely from his own time and place makes no sense as a historical Jesus either.
Right.
We can, well, when you think of great Jews in history, Spinoza among them, Shabbatai Tzvi.
Right.
I mean, there are all sorts of Jews who stand out against their Jewish context, and yet you do not explain them. You do not understand them without being in this historical context against which at times they may be pushing.
Right.
And so even with discontinuity or embarrassment, that makes sense only if Jesus is reacting to and acting within the larger Jewish-Palestinian context of his time. For instance, in chapter 4, book 4, try to make this a little more concrete, when I try to treat Jesus' relationship to the Mosaic Law, well, first of all, the overall picture is one in which Jesus and all his interlocutors, including his adversaries, all take the Mosaic Law as the given. The idea that Jesus either rejects or abolishes the Mosaic Law makes nonsense of everything that happens in the Gospels. What you have to do instead is applying all the various criteria, not just one of them, sift the material about Jesus' teaching on law, asking what may come from his own time and place, what may come from the conflicts in the early church, what may be the attitude of Matthew. The problem is Jesus in the law turns out very much to be a Matthean Jesus to a great degree because he's the one who spends most time on it. But I think the intriguing thing is when you apply all these criteria, including coherence, including, you might say, something that's more than a criterion, and an awareness of the overall situation in Palestinian Judaism at the time, which is not so much a criterion as, first of all, before you do historical Jesus, you have to know the general history of the place and time in which he's supposed to be acting. What you find is, I think, an intriguing continuity yet difference, which is so true of history in general, isn't it?
Right.
Namely, in some cases, Jesus stoutly reaffirms Mosaic law. When the rich man comes and says, Lord, what must I, teacher, good teacher, what must I do to gain eternal life? He says, you know the commandment. I mean, just he throws cold water on the enthusiasm, right? You know the command. Then he starts reciting especially the second table of the law, honor your father and mother, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, etc. All those things that the nitty-gritty of a moral life. And so, in a number of places, Jesus either just takes for granted or reaffirms the basic commandments of the law. Sometimes then what he will do is, affirming those commands, also push them further, whether we want to call that radicalizing them or deepening them or spiritual interiorization of them. That, not only is adultery of the body wrong, adultery of the mind and spirit wrong as well. Not only is physical murder wrong, murderous anger that destroys the other person psychologically is wrong as well. And indeed what he's doing with a lot of those teachings is saying, okay, yes, the physical overt action is wrong. But where does that action come from? It comes from within. The font of morality flows from within. And therefore, before we even start worrying about external purity of actions, purify the source of your moral actions first. So there is this both radicalization, there is this interiorization, which in no way is revoking the Mosaic law. The deepest, circumcise your heart, says the prophets. I mean, this is very much in keeping with the teaching of the Jewish scriptures and the prophets. So you have that, both he reaffirms the law, he deepens, spiritualizes, radicalizes the law. He then will do some new creative, innovative things which in no way revokes the law, but creates new intriguing configurations when the scribe, apparently a very well-meaning scribe, not some adversary, asked him in the temple, what is the first command among the many different commandments we have in the law? What is the first? Probably both a sincere question, but at the same time testing them. I mean, this fellow from Nazareth in Galilee, nowhere. What is he doing teaching publicly in the temple Mosaic law? So he probably wants to see, does this, is this bright Jewish boy really as smart as he's giving himself out to be? And typical in, you might call the agonistic Mediterranean world, two males in a philosophical, religious, intellectual concept, little thrust and parry there in public. And Jesus says, what? One? I'll give you two.
Yeah.
And first, what he does is, in a sense, something that would not be thought of, as one commandment aside, others, thou shalt not kill, not to. He rather goes to the Shema, the great profession of faith, is that a pious, down to this, a pious Israelite will recite morning and evening. We're told, at least in the Mishnah, that it was recited morning and evening in the temple, part of the temple, which would make perfect sense. Jesus is answering in the temple. Maybe they've just heard.
Right.
The Shema. And so, here is the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength.
Right.
And he says, that is the first. But then there's a second light to it. And he suddenly jumps from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, 4-6, back to Leviticus, 19:18b, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, nowhere in the Old Testament, nowhere in the Intertestament Judaism, nowhere in the early rabbis do you see this bringing together of those very disparate commandments. He, by rabbinic rules himself, he can do this because they have a unique grammatical structure to them. Wahavata, you shall love, plus direct object of the person.
Right.
With the exception of a few echoes of those commandments, that form never occurs again in the Jewish Mosaic law, in the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. So he is engaging in a rabbinical technique. Later on, we'll receive a formal name, Gezerah, Shua, etc. But he is very cleverly engaging in rabbinic technique for treating Scripture that creates a whole new insight about the law and about commandments. Right. This is first, this is second, no other is greater than these two. And indeed, the funny thing is, it's a prime example of it coheres perfectly with Jesus as teacher and prophet, Jewish teacher and prophet. It's discontinuous at the same time because that particular combination of those two specific quotations, listing them as first and second, never occurs in the Jewish scriptures, never occurs in intertestamental Judaism, never occurs in the early rabbis, never occurs anywhere else in the New Testament. Paul and James at times will quote, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Right. There are various allusions to the Shema at times, but nowhere does any Christian author, interestingly, take this up and precisely. We have to wait till later Christian writings like the Didache to sort of get an echo of this sort of teaching. Mm-hmm. So there's a prime example of coherence, continuity, that at the same time is creative, right, and in a funny sort of way is discontinuous in the exact configuration of it. So this, what I like about this is a prime example of many criteria coming together, right, to give us a whole picture. Yes, great coherence. He's quoting two famous commands of the Mosaic law, yes, and reaffirming them very much, but creating a new gestalt, as you say, a new whole formulation of it, a new way of seeing it, a new way of putting it together that is discontinuous at the same time. I mean, that is true history. Continuity, discontinuity, always going together. So you have these cases simply reaffirming the law. You have these cases of sharpening, radicalizing, deepening, spiritualizing the law. You have these new configurations of the law, with new emphases, new ways of seeing the law. And then finally, which brings us perhaps more to precise discontinuity, those cases where I say there are at least two where he doesn't rescind the Mosaic law, he doesn't abrogate the Mosaic law, he does seem to abrogate or rescind individual institutions or commandments affirmed or regulated by the Mosaic Law, the two being, on the one hand, divorce, and interestingly, something that's hardly ever referred to, a total prohibition of taking oaths at
Right.
all, swearing in that sense of the
Right.
word. Those two, I think, do seem to be cases where institutions that are affirmed, regulated with oaths, a few times imposed in particular cases in the Mosaic Law, he does abrogate. So continuity, discontinuity, coherence, fitting into the time, pushing against the time. I think we're beginning to touch historical reality at that point when we find all these things. But notice, I think your whole point, beware of just doing one criterion, especially embarrassment, discontinuity looks so enticing,
Right.
and the few cases are so glaring that we could easily be seduced by that into a totally discontinuous Jesus, disconnected with his own time and place. I think it's very much the other criteria, especially coherence, along with a general knowledge of Palestinian Jews in a time, that prevents that from happening.